This happened to me when I was around 10, camping with my family at a provincial park in Newfoundland, Canada, in the mid-1980s. In Newfoundland, there's a lot of traditional folklore about fairies and being fairy-led, like being mesmerized or stolen by the fairies. And although I've never really believed in that stuff, whenever I hear those tales, I can't help but think about this experience. We arrived at the campground around mid-afternoon. I remember that it was strangely empty. We saw no other occupied sites as we drove around, looking for the perfect spot. We picked our site, and as my parents were setting up, my older sister asked if she and I could go check out the little beach area, which was a short walk around a clearly marked downhill path through some birch woods. Our mom said yes, but told us to be back in 2 hours. We found the sign pointing us to the beach trail and headed down the path. Almost as soon as we were out of sight of the campground, things started to feel off. It was weirdly quiet, with a sort of muffled feeling. No birds calling, no breeze, just a thick, velvety silence. I also noticed that there were strange-looking ferns growing thickly along the paths all around us. Ferns are not an unusual sight in Newfoundland woods, but these were different from the ones I'd seen before. Bright, almost luminous green, and very, very large. Some were as tall as I was. I couldn't shake the feeling that there were people or animals hiding in them, watching us pass by. Although it had been a lovely, clear day, the weather started to change as we walked. A low-lying fog rolled in as we descended, first in tendrils close to the ground, then gradually rising around us as we went lower towards the water. Even living in Newfoundland, I never walked into a fog like that before, and it did nothing to relieve the eerie feeling that I was trying to ignore. Finally, we arrived at the steep set of wooden stairs, and following them, we emerged onto a small foggy beach. With the woods behind us, and above us it felt very closed in, and I started wishing that we were safely back with our parents at our campsite. My sister made a small noise beside me, and I turned to see what had caught her attention, although I thought we were alone. I now noticed that there was a man several meters away, standing very still and gazing silently over the water. My sister called out a friendly hello. It was Newfoundland in the 80s. People did that sort of thing. But he didn't move or appear to hear her. After a minute or two, I started to feel nervous, so I talked my sister into heading back to our campsite. This is where things get a bit fuzzy. I don't remember leaving the beach, but the next thing I knew, we were on a wide, unfamiliar dirt road. It seemed like no time had passed, but I was tired and my legs and feet felt like they'd been walking for a long time. The sun was also pretty low in the sky, which was strange because I thought we'd been gone for less than an hour. I felt disoriented and had no idea where we were, and I started to panic a bit, thinking we were lost. My sister immediately went into protective older sibling mode, saying not to worry because she was pretty sure she knew the way back. We headed off the down road in the direction she suggested, and walked for about 45 minutes or so, until we finally emerged on the campground, not far from our campsite. It was now almost completely dark, and we ran to our trailer to find our dad there, worriedly asking where we had been. Although we thought we'd been gone for less than 2 hours, my dad said we'd been gone for more than 5. He said that our mom had headed to the beach to look for us while he stayed to wait for us at the campsite. By now, full-on darkness was settling in, and our dad was worried that our mom had not returned with us. As he prepared to go out looking for her, she burst on the door, frantically saying that she had run up and down the trail multiple times and still hadn't found us. She was amazed when she saw us. The only way to that beach, aside from cutting through steep, thick woods, was to take that trail, and we had not passed her. Once we all calmed down, we ate dinner and headed to bed. As I lay in my bunk, I remember hearing my mom quietly telling my dad how creepy and strange the trail had felt. Although we planned to stay longer, we packed up and left quickly the following morning, and never returned to that campground again. I grew up in Orange County, California, but there were some real wild areas around us, believe it or not. In high school, we went out to this place called Black Star Canyon in Cleveland National Park, a big, densely wooded area of oak that stretches from OC to San Diego, almost to the border. Even contains a Marine Corps base camp. Anyways, we had been told it was haunted growing up. Turns out the true story is that there was a tribe up there that was slaughtered in the 1800s by hired fur trappers because they kept stealing the Mexican ranchers' horses for meat. Enough said for a bunch of dumb high schoolers, so we planned a night hike to this place. Our friends and I did stuff like this all the time, but I consider myself pretty skeptical, and luckily most of us were pretty level-headed. This area is well known for mountain lions too, so we were all on guard, and in agreement to turn around at any sign, even if just one of us wanted to. So the way the trail works, you park at a forestry gate, and start to walk along old asphalt narrow road that's mostly dirt from when there were sparse horses in the 50s and 60s, before the floods washed them out and land was committed to NFS, eventually turning to a full hiking trail. Along this road is a line of barbed wire, as well with all kinds of signs warning you not to cross. So here we were, typical idiots, walking down a road on a hardly slivered moon-pitch black night after midnight, and not using our flashlights to add to the flare. Well, as we go and venture deeper and deeper down this road, which we've never been on, mind you, I keep seeing what appears to be a cowboy leaning on the wooden fence post, holding the barbed wire. Just kinda leaning on it, but distinctly looking at us. I'm talking full-blown cowboy brimmed hat, just leaning. But it's just a silhouette out the side of my eye. And every time I look straight on it, there's nothing. I keep telling myself I'm logical and push it off as a trick of the eyes to keep my cool. But I keep seeing this guy every 10 or so posts, but don't say a thing to the guys. We get to a point where we've been walking for over an hour, and debating on heading back just because of the time. Just then my friend goes, "Yeah, and I keep thinking I'm seeing a cowboy along the fence line." I no shit felt my stomach drop out of me. I couldn't believe it. These were plain wooden fence posts, maybe a typical 4 foot or so tall, with mostly fields behind them. No way that looks like a person. So I open up about it also, and we all agreed to turn around. Just then my other buddy starts flipping out, ripping his shirt off, screaming about getting stung. We're all kinda confused, looking at him like he's crazy, but he insists a bee or something just stung him. So we turn on lights on his back to look and watch as 3 distinct scratches from stretching from one shoulder diagonal to the opposite hip, even drawing blood. We were done, needless to say, after that, but made it back to the car without further incident. You can probably argue the shadow was coincidence in the dark and shapes playing tricks, sure, I'll give you that. But throwing the scratch in a way that we watched happen right as we were discussing the cowboy, and in a way he couldn't do to himself, and none of us was standing in a circle to do it to him. There's something going on. So I live in the southern and eastern corner of South Dakota. There aren't a lot of wooded areas down here, but there are some. My boyfriend and I have been spending a lot of time exploring the few wooded areas that we have. Yesterday afternoon we went to this one area. We would not have expected anything to happen because it was still decently close to the town of Brandon. If anything, our concern would have been people. This park wooded area has lots of things to explore for the area, and we brought one of his friends with us. We are more intense with our hikes than he is, so he let us leave him behind, and we went exploring off the beaten path and did our own thing. By the time we were getting back to the area we left him, the sun was starting to set, and he wasn't there, so we called him up, and he said he was heading back to the car. It's important to note that during this time, we were making these screams back and forth at each other, trying to see if we could hear each other beyond the phone. My boyfriend and I had one more trail we wanted to explore, so we headed down the trail, and then eventually it was actually getting dark, so we made it back to the trail that took us back to the car. We were walking through the woods and joking about how a friend was probably going to try and scare us or some shit. We saw a deer and didn't think anything of it, but it slightly startled me originally. Finally, we made it to this area where the woods start to turn to the prairie, and we heard this scream and a really fast deer jumped through this tree that was split into 2 branches. We, being logical, started calling out to his friend, being like, "Hey, you got us, not funny." But like, it clearly wasn't our friend. We're a little on edge after that, but just picking up our pace getting into the car. Him and I took turns kinda looking behind us, and I saw what looked like an obese man just kinda standing on the trail behind us. But it had more of a ghost-like presence to him than an actual man. My boyfriend looked back at some point and said, "Hey, I don't want to scare you, but it almost looks like there's a person back there or something." My face just dropped, and I said word for word, "You saw it too?" and then we just kind of looked at each other and ran. We ended up taking the wrong path, so we had to run a lot longer. We eventually made it back to the car. His friend was there, and he swears on his life he wasn't fucking with us. Either way, no way could this dude have run that fast, or looked like what we saw behind us. When we got home, we started to look up stuff. We think it could be a skinwalker, but also this is South Dakota. We're on Lakota Sioux land, not Navajo land. Either way, it was a very creepy experience. At the time, I had the entire lower main floor unit I lived in to myself. I used to bartend, manage a nightclub a few blocks away, and we usually get home around 4 AM. This night I had just finished a 12-hour shift and was exhausted and hungry, so I decided to order some food. I place the order, get my joint rolled and ready for when the food arrives, put on a movie and wait. Eventually I hear the doorbell ring, and being alone and it being late at night, I waited to get the photo sent to the delivery app to verify my food was at the door, and so I didn't have to make small talk with the driver, as post-COVID, I still kept the option for contactless delivery. 3 to 5 minutes pass, I see the photo of my food at the doorstep and decided to get up and go get it. My bedroom window had 5 large windows that gave my full view of the path along the house, the main street in front, our garbage area, and the area right in front of our unit's door. The driver is still out there, and now he's texting me to come out and get my food. I tell him he left it in a perfect spot, I'll be out shortly to get it and thanks for delivering it. At this point I'm waiting for him to go because even though marijuana is legal here, people can still be judgmental, and I don't want to go out in my PJs to collect my food, smoke, and see a human after working all night. He doesn't leave. He keeps texting me to come outside, and now I can hear him talking to another male voice, although my window view obscures anyone else that might be out there. The food in the photo is right against my door, and I can see him edging it away and off to the side, so I have to fully step out and around a small corner to collect it. I keep texting him to tell him it's in a perfect spot. I'm glad he followed the instructions, I'll be out shortly. He starts banging on my front door, still occasionally talking to his other male voice. My food is not further away from the door. He won't stop banging and telling me to come outside. Eventually I tell him I set the delivery as no contact, as I have COVID, I lied, and don't want to get anyone sick. After I saw he read my message on the app, he put my food back by the front door and walked out of there, the back parking lot. Initially he come in through the front of the house. Something about this entire encounter felt weird. I waited about 15 minutes until I couldn't see anyone or hear anyone, and I quickly opened the door and grabbed my food. The whole ordeal lasted about an hour. My food was nice and cold, the joint was out for another day, and my heart was racing for the rest of the night. It was a random day. My family and I had a road trip planned to go somewhere far from home, just to go to a place in the Philippines called Dahilayan Bukidnon Park. While on the way, we used a GPS tracker to reach our destination. None of us were aware that the GPS may not be accurate. We followed the route. My uncle was driving the car. It was a fortune car, big enough to fit many people inside. As we got somewhere, it was still sunset, and we were going up a hill surrounded by tall trees. I fell asleep for a while because I was already exhausted from all the journey we went through, but I soon woke up from my mother's voice saying, "Dongpag bante, kimal hologta." It's in Cebuano. It meant be careful, we're gonna fall off. I looked around the car window. We were on top of a hill. The sides of the road are so thin and tight. One wrong turn and we would all come crashing down. My cousins and I were at the back of the car. We stayed quiet because we knew not to panic at situations like these. But my mom was the only one panicking. As we went further, my uncle drove slowly and thankfully we didn't fall off and managed to find an area where we could make a U-turn. It was still on the hill, but the area was wide enough. After making it back to the main road safely, we were all shaken, scared. After a couple hours of driving, it was already night. Nothing at sight, no lights, and it was nothingness. My family didn't follow the GPS this time. They used their memories because they used to be on that road before. We were going uphill again. I had no idea where it was, but all I saw was trees around the car, and the quietest sound of the car wheels driving over the gravel. Then at some point we stopped. I was confused, but it appeared that there was no continuation of the road ahead. Everyone in the car was quiet. My mother asked my uncle to check outside. When they opened the car door, it was so cold. The wind was strong and I heard the trees. It was spooky and sent a chill in my spine. My uncle closed the door as he turned on the front lights of the car. There was a line of people, many of them. I don't have any idea what they were doing alone in the woods. It was so weird. After that, I fell asleep from exhaustion. I didn't eat all day because we were stranded in the woods. The next thing, I woke up and we were already on the main road and stopped by a 7-Eleven shop, and they bought hot dogs for my cousins and I to eat. All of us were starving and had no energy. This was an experience where I think I almost died. I'm glad my family and I were safe. Just a reminder, if you want to go somewhere, you can't always trust the GPS or the maps because the routes are outdated. To start this off, me and my fiance were planning a trip to Utah for about a month. It was kind of an impulsive decision, but she wanted to visit her dad's grave in Delta, Utah. We just returned back from Colorado today. Looking back on the trip, nothing went right and so many weird things happened. On the way to the Airbnb we booked in Manti, we saw many angel numbers. She's very spiritual and I'm a little skeptical, but everything felt normal for the most part. One thing I noticed was how many deer signs I saw, but I hadn't seen a single deer at all. Once we got to the Airbnb, I personally started to feel weird. I know that town is very Mormon, and I've never had any problem with them. I think everyone has a right to their own beliefs, and I respect it. But the way the town felt around the temple was eerie to say the least. While we're in the Airbnb, something felt off. She used her pendulum to try and talk to her dad, but a spirit wouldn't let her get through to anybody. The spirit was Mormon, and she told us to leave and we weren't welcome. Just for context, we're both women and have many tattoos and piercings, and I'm Native American. I felt a gut-sinking feeling at this point, and I asked her to ask if reading a portion of the Mormon Bible would make the spirit more comfortable with us staying there. She said yes, and I read a small bit before we left to get dinner. We decided to get Denny's right outside Manti. When we walked in, the servers kind of stared at us for a good few minutes, until I stared back for a while. That's when they decided to come and give us a table. I had a weird vibe from the people there, but I didn't make a fuss because I'm sure we looked different, especially in a small town coming from Denver. Once we got our food, I almost immediately felt sick after eating. I took only 3 bites before feeling sick. I thought maybe it was because we had been on the road literally all day, but as soon as we got back to driving to the Airbnb, I threw up. We instantly chalked it up to car sickness, until I had my fiancée try a piece of my food, and she began to feel sick almost immediately as well. Yet her food was perfectly fine, and we got almost the exact same meal. We decided at that point not to eat out anymore, and to use the money for food on groceries, so we left once more. We went to the nearest Walmart, and that experience was mostly normal besides the stares and weird glances we got. As we drove up to the Airbnb, my stomach began to sink again. I swear I saw what looked like a human face inside a bush next to the garage door. I felt a cold sweat, but we decided to go inside just to try and relax. Once we were inside again and getting ready for bed, we saw bugs over and over again. Almost like the cottage was infested with spiders and earwigs. At that point, my fiancé and I decided we had enough of that town, and we booked a hotel room for the night. It was around 11 p.m. when we left, maybe a little earlier. The hotel was about 40 minutes away. The drive was alright at first, until it took us to a dirt road with nothing at all around us. At this point, my mom had called us, worried about us being out late in a foreign state. We stayed on the phone to calm our nerves. As we drove, a series of events played out. First, a black cat ran across the road in front of our car. I was more freaked out about this because of that old saying on top of everything else that had happened in that night. As we drove, there were no street lights or signs, and my phone kept losing service, so we relied on Apple Maps to get us there. A little ways in, I saw a huge cow sitting on the side of the road, just laying there. There wasn't a single other cow around him, or any other animal for that matter. Looking back on it, I didn't see its eyes. The car lights didn't reflect his eyes, and he was really close. Almost seconds after, on the other side of the same road, I saw a giant white figure that almost resembled a horse, but the legs were too skinny. and it had no head and it moved almost like it glided. Come to find out, my fiance saw what looked like a man walking to our car as soon as we got on the dirt road and didn't say anything because she was scared. I didn't say anything about the figure I saw either because I know speaking it out is a bad idea, especially at night, and I didn't want to scare my fiance. Once we got to the hotel, the gut sinking was gone and we felt better. But I had a horrific nightmare about my mom dying and crawling around the ceiling like something out The Grudge. And when I woke up, my fiance blamed the road for my dream. I think she was mostly joking, but I'm starting to think she was real. Even as I'm trying to write this out, I'm having trouble with my keyboard lagging or Reddit closing me out of it. I switched to my notes app to write this, but it makes it so much more eerie. This just happened a few days ago, so it's still fresh in my mind. But I wanted to share this because I want to know if anybody else knows what the fuck happened that night, or if that town has something wrong with it. I once met up with an old friend of mine, a friend I had known for a few years prior to the meetup in November 2017. I had actually met this person on a dating site. However, as time went on, the relationship between us became strictly platonic. So I completely trusted this person. We met up in a town behind a bus station on a grassy hill surrounded by trees and a tall wall. Our meeting was just to have a smoke, get a little high, and to have a small catch-up. The meetup was fine. I had actually started smoking weed a few months before, so I was still relatively new to it. He had brought something new for me to try, purple haze. I wasn't at all anxious about trying it as I completely trusted this person. I would never believe that he would lie to me. He had packed a full blunt for me, but I only managed to smoke a quarter of the blunt. We spoke during this time, about work, our previous relationships, and random stuff. About half an hour later, I started to feel extremely lightheaded and anxious. I suddenly had this strange feeling where I did not feel comfortable at all, and I really wanted to go home. When I asked him if I could go home, he offered to take me home, but I said no, it's okay. He offered again. Please, let me take you home. You'll be safe with me. I won't hurt you. I shook my head and said, no thank you, I can take myself home. When I started to walk away, I felt like I was walking on a cloud. My head became dizzy and my eyesight was a little blurry, but I never felt like this before, and in time I started to panic. When we made our way down the hill towards the bus station, I was relieved, as there were a lot of people around, so if anything happened, someone would step in. I became extremely terrified of him. I had this horrible feeling in my gut that told me to get away from him, and when I got to the bus station, I told him I would call my taxi here and go home. His tone was no longer nice, but very stern. I'm gonna take you home now. And he began to pull at my jacket. I told him no, and that I was going home on my own. And then he pulled my jacket harder, and I fell against him. He pulled me into him and told me I didn't need to be scared of him. But I was. I was so terrified. At this point I started to feel very paranoid, and I couldn't see properly. I pushed him away from me and rubbed my eyes and called for a taxi. He tried to pull my phone from me and yelled in my face, "Do you ever listen? I'm taking you home." I noticed a few people had stopped and asked if I was okay. All I remember was that I wanted to go home. So Lei kindly called a taxi for me and waited with me, made sure I was okay and helped me into the taxi. During the time when I waited for the taxi, he kept trying to get me to come to his car with him, but the lady that looked after me told him to go home and that she was going to take me home instead. So he left. When I got home, I gave the taxi driver money and told him to keep the change. I didn't want to wait around. I just wanted to get into my bed because at that time it was the only place I would feel safe from harm. That evening, I laid in my bed for 5 hours straight, staring at the ceiling. I don't remember if I thought about anything or if my mom came in at any time. I just remember laying in bed doing nothing until the paranoia and the sickly feeling began to wear off. I remember looking at my phone and seeing I had 32 missed calls from him, 10 voicemails left, and 50 plus messages. The messages were weird. He had sent around 20 messages just asking where I was and when I got home. And in one of the voicemails, he had told me how he had this fantasy of taking me home whilst drugged up and tying me up. He wanted to blindfold me and he wanted me to submit myself to him. I freaked out and blocked him on all social media, and I even blocked his number. Before the blocking, I told him if he ever contacted me again, then I would call the police. I heard nothing from him for a month, until I received a text from an unknown number asking me how I was. I hadn't given my number to anyone, so I ignored it, then received another message a few minutes later saying they missed me and that they would see me soon. I asked who they were, but I got no response. In 2020, my mom and I decided to go on an overnight camping trip together on the Oregon coast. I picked what looked like a pretty campsite from a campsite app, and off we went. When we got there, we realized it was right off the highway, but there were enough trees and a fence up front that you couldn't really see the road. But the gate was just a metal gate that swung into place, no locks. There was a house on either side, but the property was fenced in on both sides. We pitched the tent pretty far back, close to the woods on the back of the property. And the closest house was about 100 yards away, and the highway was about 200 yards away. But again, it was all mostly fenced in and surrounded by tall firs. It was a lovely sight, and my mom raved about how beautiful and peaceful it was. I will say that I got a feeling of dread as soon as we walked onto the property. But we arrived late, and I didn't know if we'd be able to get to a new spot quickly. My mom could tell I was nervous, but for some reason I put her enjoyment of the beauty of the campsite over my feeling of dread. We made a nice campfire and enjoyed some hot chocolate as we watched the fire. I kept an eye out and didn't see or hear anything odd. My mom went to bed before I did, and I stayed up and watched the fire for a long time before going to bed. Finally, I tucked in, very exhausted from staying up. At 2 a.m., I woke up to twigs snapping and what sounded like someone dragging their fingers on the side of the tent up to the front. I sat up and grabbed the phone and the only weapon I had, a large flashlight, and unzipped my sleeping bag in case I needed to fight anyone. There was a full moon that night, and I couldn't tell if it was a person's shadow falling on the tent or if it was a tree branch shadow moving from the wind. It sounded like there were 2 people outside trying to be quiet. We had brought our boots inside, so there was no indicator outside of who was in the tent. It felt like they were trying to gauge the tent while I was listening for where they were. I had made sure to make enough noise so they knew someone inside was alert, but no more than that. If they know someone is awake, they can't surprise us, but they also don't know who is inside the tents and whether or not we have guns. I sat there in the dark until dawn. My mom slept through the whole thing. When we got up and out of the tent, small things had been moved. Our camp chairs had cup holders. One cup that had been in a cup holder was on the ground. A pen that had been in a cup holder was also on the ground. My mom raves about how good her sleep was and how refreshing it was to camp there, so I didn't want to burst her bubble or scare her. We packed up and I didn't tell her, but let her have a nice memory of deep rest and relaxation while camping on this beautiful property. Was it someone living in the woods, someone walking down the highway in the middle of the night? Creepy neighbors, who knows? My mom got a great experience and I got a refund and a fear of camping. The property owner said they might set up cameras to keep an eye on things in the future. People are scarier than almost anything else that could be out there. I've never really had paranormal experiences, but I cannot explain this. I'm in college, and me and some other 7 people from my school went on a backpacking trip, and we had 2 experienced leaders. We drove to Zaleski State Park, which is an Appalachian region of Ohio. It was early April this year, and it was cold and everything was still dead from winter. After hiking miles into the forest, we set up a camp at the backpacking campsite, and there were a couple other groups of people as well. A few of them were friendly older couples, and then 2 college-aged girls. Everyone was pretty spread out from each other. We set up camp further away from everyone else. I have always been able to sense the energies of places. The energy in this area wasn't great. It was almost spooky. Each of us had individual 1-person tents, and we formed a kind of cluster on this site, with my tent being in the back so no one was behind me. Our cluster was also right next to the forest, because this backpacking site was like a big cleared off square in the middle of the trees. Fast forward, I'm dead asleep around 2 a.m. I wake up to leaves crunching right behind my tent. I hear footsteps walking in circles around my tent. They had a sort of heaviness to them that couldn't be a deer or a dog. Also, it sounded like just two legs. I cannot make this up. This creature was circling my tent for long periods of time, slowly creeping to the sides of my tent, and then just stopping for periods of time, and then would move on to walking around the rest of our tent cluster. I could hear a human-like breathing from the mouth when it was close to my tent, like a light sort of heaving. I was shaking, too scared to unzip my tent and investigate. I kid you not, this occurred for hours, and it seemed I was the only one awake. Out of nowhere, I see an illuminated light shape from my tent. Although I couldn't tell what it was from inside my tent because it was all zipped up, it was like a warm glow, and it didn't move, like a flashlight would. I was paralyzed in fear. I simply couldn't believe it was an animal. At some point, I fell asleep due to sheer exhaustion, but I could hear the heavy footsteps circling until I did. In the morning, I questioned my fellow campers about it, and my leader admitted she heard the footsteps and noises as well, admitting it was bizarre and she would have investigated had she not been so groggy. One of the boys in the group said he also noticed the light that came, but thought it was someone else. Not a single person in this group went up to the bathroom or turned on a light that night. I heard things about the Appalachian regions being creepy and bizarre, and now I believe it. I live in a small town in North Italy, a valley between our typical old mountains, so just behind my home there's lots of hikes. I always lived here, and I like mountains, plus I'm getting in shape so the terrain is ideal, especially because I'm really familiar with it. So last summer I was walking my usual route when I thought I could try to have a short hike before sunset, and I took a route. Now I don't know if you're familiar with Italian ground, but there aren't these big spaces and long distances typically of the US, I imagine. Picture the average small town of 2,500 people, starting from the bottom in a 2 to 3 hour hike. You're on top of the mountain, and the route I took was about 30 minutes to arrive halfway the mountain, to a big Christian cross and a nice view. I was with my dog, a well-trained Spitz, a nice company with good instincts that I trust. He's a working dog more than a pet, despite his size. So we took the path and started making our way up, nice and relaxed, but active as we didn't have too much light time left. I just figured that if the light went low, I'd just turn around and head home. No chance of getting lost. Woods immediately engulf us. Pretty dense, but it's the norm. Not even 15 minutes of walking, and I'm paralyzed with this overwhelming sense of dread. The woods are completely silent. My skin crawls up just thinking about it. Even my dog stops, anxious. I just couldn't understand what was scaring me so much in the sudden silence. I couldn't move a muscle. I read The Gift of Fear, and the only time I didn't listen to my guts, I lost my spleen in an accident. So wide-eyed and hyper-alert, I forced myself to move and noped out of there. It was like my brain was screaming, if you stay here, you'll die. Walking back, I couldn't stop the urge to continuously look behind me. At some point I was practically running, and I kept thinking that if I sprained an ankle there, I would die. The dog seemed relieved when we had turned back, and he kept looking behind too. When we finally made it out of the woods and back on the road, I felt a wave of relief and ran all the way back home from the adrenaline I had. To this day, I don't know what happened, and I haven't gone back. We were hanging out with our two new friends, husband and wife. Let's say their names are John and Mary. They decided to camp at Todd Lake Recreation Center, which is in George Washington National Forest, and invited us to spend time at their campsite, have a few beers, and relax by the campfire. My partner and I decided we weren't up for overnight camping, but were down to hang out for a bit. The recreation center was only 45 minutes from home, so we thought we could drive if we didn't have but a few drinks, ate food, and chilled for a couple of hours. So we get there around 4:30 p.m. and have camp snacks, sandwiches, chips, nothing special, and some alcoholic drinks. We wander down to the lake and let their dog swim. Then we decide to head back to the campsite and start a fire. I knew we weren't staying the night, so I kept track of how many drinks I had and the food I ate to ensure I was suitable for the drive later. In total, I had like 5 drinks the entire night. Not to sound like an alcoholic or anything, but 5 drinks do not explain what happened to us that night. I can handle my alcohol, and I'm responsible while drinking by pacing myself, eating food and drinking water in between beverages. So we're hanging by the fire with John and Mary, and next thing you know, John says, "Hey, do you guys want to walk down to the lake?" And we respond, "Yeah, sure, let's do it." The campsite has a short walking path to the lake, probably half a mile away. It should only take minutes to get there. Now this is when it gets weird. I look at my cell phone and see it's 8:30 p.m. and decide to put my phone in the car before we walk down to the lake because I don't want to lose it. The next thing I knew, I woke up in the woods, passed out on the ground on a trail with my partner, in the middle of George Washington National Forest. We were an hour away from the campsite, and John and Mary were nowhere to be found. My partner was on his back with his head turned to the side, and I was laying halfway on the moss, and the other half on him with my head turned to the side. Almost as if we were placed perfectly. We were lost, and both felt extremely confused and sick. We both started throwing up, and had to take breaks walking out to try and find John and Mary's campsite. It took us an hour to get back, and it appeared we had hiked an hour outside of the recreation center. We both had zero recollection of how we got there, why we were passed out in the middle of the woods at night, and why the 5 seltzer with food over a multiple hour span made either one of us be so sick and lose memory at the same time. My partner was completely disoriented, started screaming for help. I was begging him to be quiet because I felt so sick and had no idea where we were. I needed a minute to collect myself and get my bearings to try and hike out of our current situation. Something to know about us is we both are avid hikers and backpackers, and are very comfortable outdoors in nature, even alone. However, at that moment, I was so thankful I didn't wake up in the woods at night on a trail alone. Thankfully, he was with me. The entire time, we felt like we were being watched as we tried to find our way back. It was unsettling. I was telling my partner when we were trying to find our way back to the campsite, something felt very wrong. And when we got back, we needed to get in the car and leave. I felt it in my bones, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what happened. We were both utterly shocked that we somehow both conveniently blacked out simultaneously. I know what you all are thinking. Were we drugged? We felt that too. But why would John and Mary, our supposed friends, drug us? And why would they drug us and carry us deep into the forest? It doesn't add up. We finally made it back to the campsite, and I first opened my car and grabbed my phone to see what time it is. It was 2:30 a.m. My heart sank. How did this happen? How did it go from 8:30 p.m. when we were walking down to the lake, which was half a mile or less from their campsite, to 2:30 in the morning? Neither of us liked not knowing what happened to us in that lost time. So before we decided to leave, my partner knocked on their tent and said, "Hey John, we're leaving. What happened, man? We need to get out of here. Something's off." John then replies, "Where's Mary?" And my partner and I look at each other concerned and say to John, "What do you mean? She's not in the tent with you?" And John replies, "No, I thought she was with you two." That's when we all decided to search for Mary. John said the last thing he remembered was we were all hanging out by the fire and asked if we wanted to go down to the lake. And then hours later, we woke up underneath the picnic table at the campsite, not remembering how he got there. However, something seemed fishy, and he was far too relaxed. We found Mary down the trail to the lake, slumped over, asleep in the woods near the campsite. Neither remembered what happened and why we all ended up in these places. No one can remember what happened for those few hours. It was misty, dark, and foggy on the mountain, and I was shivering, teeth chattering, feeling sick, and just ready to go home. We got in the car and returned to our house, but it took a while to settle enough to sleep. When we spoke to John the next morning, they laughed it off and said, "Haha, maybe we shouldn't drink so much next time we hang out. I remember all of us hanging by the fire and then mentioning us going down to the lake, but I stayed back to deal with the dog, and you three went down there." John changed his story from what he said the night before. Something didn't sit right with me. The Todd Lake Recreation Center was almost empty. We only saw one other family camping that night, and they weren't anywhere near our campsite, which was also odd. My partner and I don't think we drank enough to the point it would cause us to black out, especially at the same time. So what did happen? We were sore and a little cut up, but our only thoughts were, this must have been something paranormal, or they did drug us. I started to get flashbacks of memory, and all I remember was John's face on the beach, then black. Did aliens abduct us? Was it something from Appalachian folklore? Like a Mothman or some bizarre creature? Did we all drink too much? Did we get drugged? My partner lost his phone that night, so I called a ranger the following Monday, and they said they found it in the woods, busted up between campsites 5 and 6. But John and Mary were camping at campsite 1. The ranger mailed it back to us because I didn't want to drive back there. I had a horrible pit in my stomach. The phone never turned back on. Even though the front of the screen was perfectly intact, it was only the back of the phone that was busted. A part of me doesn't want to know what's on that phone. The next day my partner was violently ill, and I was shivering with teeth chattering and chill bumps all day. We honestly probably should have gone to the hospital. In my 30 years, I've never experienced something like this, and to this day, we're skeptical about meeting our new friends or having new people enter our lives. Either way, we are both so grateful we made it home safely that night, and we have each other. For some context, I live in a major city and currently don't do a lot of driving due to ongoing issues with my car. The pandemic has made me turn to more delivery apps in general. So the other day around 1 PM, I decided to order some lunch after doing a lot of cleaning. I placed the Uber Eats order and found something to watch while I waited for the food. Within a few minutes, the driver accepted the order, and I noticed right away that the driver, Anthony, was on a bike. I didn't have a profile picture or any deliveries on record. At first, I wasn't alarmed at all. I was always amused, like, oh wow, guess I'm this person's first ever customer. But then a full 30 minutes passed with no driver movement on the app. And at this point, I think maybe something's glitching out or the driver is stuck. I contacted support via the chat option, and they ended up assigning a new driver because they couldn't reach the first one. Odd, but whatever. Now is when it starts to get a little weirder. The new driver assigned is in the exact same spot as the original driver was. They are also on a bike, and also have no profile picture, and have no prior deliveries as well. And this driver's name was Lori. I let another 20 minutes pass with no driver movement before I message them myself and say, "Hi there, are there any issues with the order?" The app shows that the driver saw the message, but no response. All this time I'm checking to see if Uber Eats is maybe experiencing issues. None that I could find. And at this point, while I'm definitely weirded out, I'm mostly just hungry, so I contact support again to request some assistance. They reassigned the driver again and apologized for the inconvenience. Same deal, they also tried to contact the driver with no response. Finally, the third driver assigned is the exact same scenario. Same spot, on a bike, no profile picture, no prior deliveries. Only this time the name is Robert. And before I can react and go about cancelling the order at this point because I'm tired of dealing with this, he suddenly has my food and immediately messages me the following. "Hello, have your food. What's your phone number?" And I responded right away with, "I'm not super comfortable giving my phone number out when you can just message me here." And he responded again with, "What's your number? Be there in 10. How old are you?" And at this point, the alarm bells are going off, and I contact support immediately to have the order cancelled and get further assistance. I got contacted to Uber's safety team, who informed me that the order had been cancelled, I'll be refunded, and started taking down the details of the strange interaction. As I'm giving the woman on the phone the info she needs, I'm starting to calm down, thinking this was just a creep or something. And that's when I hear a man's voice at the front door. "Miss Metal Gear 42069, I have your food." And I can't even describe the chill that went down my spine because of the way he said it. Making things even worse, the Uber safety woman on the phone with me heard him as well and goes, "Is that him? We cancelled the order." I poked my head around the door. The main heavy door was open. The metal screen door was closed and locked, but allowed to see each other. I got a good look at him, and when he saw me on the phone, he went from smiling to looking furious. He suddenly got right up against the door and kept asking who I was on the phone with. And at this point, I've started asking him to please leave because he's making me uncomfortable, and he's getting more and more angry, and at this point starts pounding on the door and grabbing the doorknob while shouting to be let in. The woman on the phone is asking if I'm okay. The man is still shouting, so basically I'm in full meltdown mode at this point and hurriedly close the heavy door to lock it. The man is becoming borderline belligerent as he kicks my door down, and the woman tells me to call the police. He ended up walking away from my house about a minute after that and back up to the sidewalk, and for a moment I thought he fucked off, so I finished my conversation with the Uber safety woman so she could submit the report. Once she submitted it, I called the police and told them what happened. They weren't incredibly helpful at first, since he didn't actually break in or put his hands on me, and they told me if he came back to call again, and they would send an officer out. I did end up having to call them again and give a full report, description of the man, since he didn't end up leaving right away. He stayed in the neighborhood for almost 20 minutes. According to one of my neighbors, after she heard the yelling, she saw the man I described walk back up from my house to the sidewalk and hop into a truck with another man in the passenger seat. And they apparently just sat there staring at people walking by and being incredibly sketchy. And that's when she walked back towards my house and asked me what happened. Luckily, she was able to give myself and the cop a description of the vehicle and the other man as well. So basically, this was a very bizarre and uncomfortable experience. This started when I was at my childhood friend's apartment for what was supposed to be a fun little movie night. We hadn't hung out in a while and we were catching up. Her place was cozy, a little disorganized, and full of girly decor. We were in our comfiest sweatpants about to watch princess movies. Her apartment isn't the most tidy. Things are a bit scattered around, but it's clean and so authentic, which always made me feel at home. We decided on ordering pizza for dinner. She mentioned that Sherwood, someone I hadn't met yet, would bring the pizza over. At first, I was not happy to hear that. I thought that meant she had invited other friends over to join us, which wasn't what I had in mind, but I was in for the surprise. Sherwood turned out to just be our delivery guy for the night. He wasn't joining us. When he got to the apartment, there was this awkward air about him. He was obviously nervous, fumbling a bit with the pizza boxes, and not quite making eye contact. My friend introduced us quickly, and it was clear from her overly thankful demeanor that Sherwood did a lot more for her than just fetch dinner. After handing us the pizza, there was this brief moment of forced small talk. My friend was super nice to him despite his awkwardness. He wasn't the best conversationalist and seemed really out of place. Then Sherwood asked for my number. I was in a tough spot because our mutual friend was sitting right there, so I just gave it to him. Yeah, we chatted for maybe 5 minutes before my friend gave him a cue to leave with something like, "Thank you so much for dropping this off." He seemed to get the hint. We both gave him like a hug before my friend said something like, "Drive safe," giving him another kind of cue to leave. When I asked my friend what that was all about, she explained that Sherwood was her unpaid personal assistant. He did her grocery shopping, he dropped off pizza, and he did all this other stuff. I think Sherwood was just a really lonely guy, desperate for interaction, especially female interaction. My friend and I were both young and immature back then. We were about 23, but I think we both knew something was seriously wrong with Sherwood. It was a little hard to articulate because we couldn't point out exactly what his problem was. Sherwood started a group chat with me and my friend. He just sent a meme or two every week. It felt like he was trying to stay relevant without being intrusive. Maybe he was used to being sidelined or even blocked by other girls in the past. It felt like he was trying to make me remember him, but also carefully trying not to give me a reason to block him too. I can't speak on his behalf, that's just what it felt like. Sherwood also helped with errands. The first time, I said, "Thanks for asking, but no thank you." He asked every weekend after that. One day I made the mistake of accepting his help. I knew better, but I just did. I had recently found a great deal for a new washing machine on Craigslist, but I had no idea how to pick it up and install it. When I mentioned in the chat, Sherwood excitedly volunteered to take care of the whole thing. He handled the whole pickup and installation like a total champ, which saved me so much hassle. I tried to pay him for his efforts because I wanted to show appreciation, but he wouldn't accept my money. I insisted, and eventually he suggested that I could repay him by joining him for a hike. I was uneasy about this. It felt a bit too personal and almost like it could be mistaken for a date. but Sherwood framed it as nothing more than a friendly outing, like a transaction to balance out the favor. I agreed to the hike. I rationalized it by telling myself that it was a fair trade for installing the washing machine, and that it was genuinely a form of payment, especially since I didn't think he had too many friends. This hike felt like maybe a way for him to have some companionship. I thought it might be nice helping him. Part of me was still uneasy about spending time with him in such an isolated setting. The day of the hike, Sherwood picked this trail that was nearby. I had been there before. It's gorgeous. As we walked along together, he chatted about ordinary things like work, the weather, and his hobbies. Everything seemed normal until he suggested we go off the main path to see something special he wanted to share. Like, what could that even mean? We reached the secluded spot, and there was a dead body. My heart pounded so violently as Sherwood stood there so eerily calm and nonchalant. The casualness in his demeanor made me feel even more uneasy. It felt like he wasn't just showing me a dead body, but also revealing this darker side of him. It smelled bad, but not like in the movies. I didn't even know how long it had been there. I'm not a biologist, but my guess is that it had smelled a lot worse before, but now it had gone down. That moment I mumbled some excuse about needing to go back quickly and started walking briskly towards the main path. I was urging Sherwood to follow me. I thought this was some twisted mind game, like a way to intimidate me or show that he wasn't just some harmless little boy. Maybe he was trying to send a message that said, "You should know I'm familiar with things like this." Oh, there's another possibility. Maybe he just wanted me to think about him more. Sometimes when I talk to people, I feel like they only notice me for the time that we're together, and then they won't think of me again until the next time we meet. It's possible Sherwood felt that way with me, and maybe he thought showing me a dead body would make him less forgettable. I have no idea. But on the surface, he seemed oblivious to how inappropriate this was. As we walked back together, I was in full fight-or-flight mode, instinctively looking around to see if there were other hikers or rangers, anyone who could make me feel like I wasn't alone. The moment I spotted someone else on the trail, I called out, not to expose Sherwood, but just asking for directions back to the parking area. I wanted to make sure Sherwood and I wouldn't be left alone together. I asked the gentleman to walk us back to the parking lot. I wasn't going to take no for an answer. I kept pretending like I was confused about his directions, and eventually he agreed to just walk us there. Getting help from that guy was my way of re-anchoring myself to safety and normality, while I was still under the shock of what Sherwood had shown me. We got to the parking area. There I called my friend and told her I was with Sherwood. I suggested he could drop me off with her and that we'd be there in 20 minutes. Sherwood agreed. That was my way of making sure that if anything happened, it was on the record that Sherwood was the last person to have been with me. Also, I immediately texted my friend what had happened to get that on record too. When I got to her apartment, we said thanks to Sherwood and kindly told him to go away. I had already told her through the text, but then I started going into all the details. The fact that the body had insects, the fact that the face was decomposing but still recognizable, etc. Her reaction was pure horror. Not just about the dead body, but also how nonchalantly Sherwood had treated the whole situation. She confessed she always sensed something was off about him, even though she never imagined anything this disturbing. We both agreed that we needed to remove Sherwood from our lives. She admitted she felt stuck, and she had become too reliant on Sherwood to just fire him cold turkey. We planned out how we could do it. It was this gradual phasing out plan. We would limit our interactions to times when others were present. We would slowly reduce our response to his texts. I would never ask for his help again, and my friend would ask for less and less help. Sherwood kept texting during weekends, offering to run errands or asking if we needed anything, to which my friend would reply, "I'm trying to work on being more independent, but you've been such a nice help." Eventually, as my friend started dating someone new, she introduced Sherwood to her boyfriend. Sherwood never contacted her after that. I had called the cops the same night of the incident, but it was a while before we heard more news about it. At least a full month later, a news report confirmed discovering a dead body in that area where Sherwood had taken me hiking. They made an arrest, not of Sherwood, but of this other guy that Sherwood followed on Instagram. I have no idea if Sherwood was connected to the murder. Reflecting on everything, I think there's one clear moral of the story. Trust your instincts. I work at a pizza place, Usually inside, as my insurance does not cover claims when driving for business, but occasionally I will cover a delivery shift for one of the drivers because the money is good. Our delivery area includes a few new developments, upper middle class cookie cutter neighborhoods, an older 1940s era village, 2 apartment complexes, some trailer parks, and a bunch of rural areas. Not rural to the point seeing hundreds of stars at night, but enough that you couldn't hear your neighbors yell. So about a week ago I was covering a delivery shift. I came back to the shop feeling pretty good. I was averaging $5 a delivery and they've all been pretty close, and checked to see if I have any more deliveries. I had one to an address I've never seen before. We have mostly semi-regular deliveries, so an address that doesn't seem the least bit familiar is odd. It's out on one of the more rural roads. I asked the kid who took the order what was up because there were special instructions on the ticket. He says, "Yeah, they said go around back because the front door is not operational." I'm like, okay, that's not uncommon. People often want you to go around back. Either they painted the door, the house shifted, and it's a bitch to open, or they're just hanging out back. So as I'm driving out to the house and I get an odd feeling. I don't really like the idea of going to the back of some house out on the sticks. It would all be too easy for some thugs to order pizza to an abandoned house. There are quite a few in the more rural areas, then jump the delivery guy. I figure I'll scope the place out when I get there, and if it seems sketchy, just call them and make some bullshit about how it's against company policy to go around the back of the house to prevent robberies. As I'm driving to the house, I realize it's towards the end of this road that gets less populated the further down you go. Great. I'm pretty near the address and driving slow. I see this abandoned looking house and set back from the roads with no address and in a bunch of trees. I think, that house better not be it. So I drive past and check the next house's address, and lo and behold, that abandoned looking one was the right house. At this point I'm not super worried though, because out in the boonies the standards of upkeep on your house are pretty low, so a house in despair isn't unusual. So I double back to this house and pull into the driveway. At this point I'm getting bad vibes, it just doesn't feel right. So I park my car at the very end of the driveway with the rear of my car on the shoulder, so anyone passing by can clearly see it. At this point I call back to the shop and tell them I'm at this sketchy house, and if I don't call back in 4 or 5 minutes, call me, and if I don't answer, call the cops. While I'm on the phone, I take a chance to take a good look at this house. It looks extremely abandoned, and not just in despair. The driveway is crumbling, bits of gravel, and there are weeds growing out of it. There is no mailbox, no trash cans, no car, lawnmowers, landscaping, no kids' toys, absolutely nothing in the yard. The yard hasn't been mowed in what looks like years. The house is total crap. The roof is all but falling apart, the siding is falling apart, the back deck, which comes around the side, is falling apart. The only part of the house that looks even a little bit decent is the allegedly non-functioning front door. The windows are all shut, and they all have blinds or curtains shut. The few that aren't are actually boarded up. I don't even see any wires running to this house. It's not dark, but it is dusk, and there isn't a sign of any lights on in the house. At this point I'm starting to get pretty nervous. I'm a 5'10" male, 180 pounds. Not in any great shape, but I did take karate for 10 years, so I'm not helpless. But I do try to avoid any sort of confrontation as I can. I'm not too concerned about getting robbed. No skin off my teeth, it's not my money. I mean, I would rather not get robbed, but I'm mostly worried about getting jumped or killed. It's a fairly safe area, but recently there have been some rather unsavory people moving in from the city. A big spike in home invasions and robberies. More worrying, a few stabbings and assaults. So it's time to either nut up or shut up. I'm not just going to go charging in there like a fool, so I get out my phone and call the number they gave when ordering. While I'm doing that, I'm also getting the pizza out and making sure to leave my door open. A running car half in the road at an abandoned house with door open looks suspicious, right? I figure if shit goes down, it might look out of place enough to make someone stop. Not that there's really any traffic this far down the road. I'm starting to walk up to the house while the phone rings. It rings twice and then an automated message comes on. It says something along the lines of this phone number is associated with the internet texting app. One of the free ones you download and lets you send free texts and whatever. I think it was Haywire. We've had few issues with people using numbers from those services for pranks in the past. This is a huge red flag. My heart is now pounding in my throat, and my whole body is telling me to bail. I don't want to get a reputation for being a flaky bitch as a driver, and lose any future delivery shifts, and that is why I have not yet bailed. So I'm just standing there holding a pizza looking at this house, but not wanting to venture around to the back of it. I'm hoping that the resident will look out the window and come out by the road to get their food. So I'm looking at the front windows, checking for some sign of life. I see a blind go up on the one window next to the front door, and a really creepy looking guy with a hat pulled low and big sunglasses is looking out. Remember, he is in a completely dark house surrounded by trees at dusk. There is no reason for him to be wearing sunglasses. I also see what appears to be a big guy standing behind him in the room. This could have been anything though. When he sees me looking at me, mouths something, and he darts away, presumably towards the allegedly broken front door. At this point I noped the fuck out. I had stayed pretty close to my car, so it was only a few steps away, so I jumped into the driver's seat, threw the pizza into the passenger seat. Something I would never do since I'm really anal about keeping my car clean. I slam it into reverse before I get the clutch all the way in, so I grind my gears a bit. Again, something I never do. Without looking, I simultaneously slam and lock my door, and floor it backwards onto the main road, slipping my clutch horribly, but at this point I don't care. I don't want to fuck around and risk a stall. I didn't even check for cross traffic. I start to drive away and look back at the house. The screen door on the outside of the front door is now open, but the front is still shut. The guy isn't out in the yard yelling, "Wait, come back," or anything. He's just gone. So I pull over a little ways up the road to call back to the shop and tell them that I'm all good, and I'll elaborate when I get back. The people never called back to inquire about their food. People usually call if their pizza is 15 minutes late, and these people never got it, so it's really strange they didn't call. Pretty much confirming they were up to no good. After telling my coworkers about it, we concluded it was definitely a robbery at the very least. So we put the address and phone number on our no deliveries list, and ate their pizza. I doubt I would have actually gotten murdered or anything. Robbed with maybe a gun pulled or a little roughing up, yes, but it was still very unnerving. That I easily could have gotten into some serious trouble by just doing my job. Especially if the idiots picked a slightly less abandoned house to set up. At. Montour, Ohio is a railroad town boasting a creepy town center with an old railway station, surrounded by a rural landscape peppered with brick buildings, sprawling properties with dense woods and cornfields, guarded by sunny farmhouses of varying age and size. A 44S runs one lane each direction. I made this drive regularly to visit my then boyfriend. Familiar with the area, I would usually have music while enjoying the drive and the fresh air. One day in the middle of summer in 2011, I was driving on 44S into Montour, making my usual trip in the mid-afternoon on a beautiful clear day. I passed a quiet area just a few miles from my destination. On the right, houses on 2-3 acre lots with big front yards, longer driveways and attached garages shaded by tall trees, with thick foliage with backyards full of dense woods. On the left across the road there's a cornfield bordered by a deep grassy drainage culvert stretching several miles long. I see something that looks off up ahead. It's hard to make out, but there's something on the opposite side of the road, where the cornfields are. It's way off and hard to make out, but it's clearly a large brown hairy mass right next to the road. It's too dark in color to be a dead deer. Maybe an escaped cow? No, not that either. Something about this mass on the side of the road is unlike anything I've ever seen, and I just can't figure it out because I keep having to look back at the road. I see it move. Maybe whatever it is isn't roadkill, and it's just an animal grazing on the side of the road in the culvert. I rolled my window down to get a better look. I slow down as little as I pass by, and all at once, I realize what I'm seeing. The hairy mass is a dead dog, being eaten by another dog. The biggest dog I've ever seen, with the freakiest, emptiest eyes. As I pass by, this thing pulls its face out of the dog carcass it's eating to look up at my car and locks eyes with me. They looked right through me, and it felt like what I can only describe as pure evil. I pass it in my car at about 40 miles per hour. As I start to freak out and roll up my window, I check my mirror for a double take because I absolutely do not believe what I saw. And I see that its head is already back down again, eating and out of view with no other defining features. It was totally unbothered by my car. I slow down, then speed up, then slow down, then speed up again. I want to know what I saw, but I completely freak out. I look for the nearest driveway on my right side, maybe 50-70 yards away, and peel into the driveway to turn around and go back. As I put my car in park, I see that a man is home and is sitting in a lawn chair outside his garage, facing parallel to the road, blissfully unaware of what just up the road behind him, while his two Labradors amble around him. He sees me and assumes I'm just using his driveway to turn around, but is unsettled when I drive almost all the way up the driveway, park my car and get out, still freaking out. "Take your dogs inside. You need to get inside your house." I tell him what I saw, and he gets up out of his lawn chair to look where I'm pointing, but the trees at the edge of his property block the scene from view, and it's just a bit too far. I get back in my car and keep warning him to keep his dogs inside. If our places had been exchanged, I probably would have called the cops on someone who came ripping into my driveway rambling about some wild animal in a panic. I was terrified, and full of adrenaline with no regard for ruining this guy's peaceful afternoon. I don't remember how I left it with him, but I got back in my car, backed out onto 44, and headed back north from the way I came to get a better look at this thing, still from the safety of my moving car. I passed where it was and it's gone. I drove back and forth one more time in disbelief at the whole thing. Further back that I thought to be safe, thinking I underestimated the distance between the carcass and the house I stopped at. But there was a hole in the corn where whatever this thing was had clearly drugged the dog it was eating to finish away from the road. I remember sitting stopped on the side of the road after turning around again and heading back south, looking across the road at this hole in the corn that looked far too innocent to do justice to what I had just seen. No one driving by would even notice it. I had my head on a swivel around my car and locked my doors, but something told me I wouldn't see it again and had to get out of there. So I did. When I passed the house again, the man and dogs weren't in the yard anymore, and the garage was closed. Completely rattled, I called my then boyfriend, whose house I was headed to, as I drove away, but if I remember correctly, he didn't answer. When I got there, I was so shaken up and couldn't make sense of what I had seen. This was right after high school, and he still lived with his folks in a cold, creaky farmhouse in Ravenna they had just moved into. And I did not feel safe in that house that night. I brought back all my childhood fears of being afraid of the dark and what was under the bed, like it could be anywhere. I remember this like it was yesterday, and even though I've shared this story with a few friends, I've never written it down. Whatever this was built like a dog, but bigger than any dog I've ever seen. It was very dark brown with dirty hair. I've considered it might have been a black bear with a mange, but even though I only got a quick glimpse, it didn't move like a bear. And the piercing eyes in broad daylight, those were something else. It was canine, not Bigfoot or any other common myth that I'm aware of. I haven't done too much research into what it could be because I think part of me is scared to know what it could be. Black dog? A werewolf? I have no idea. It was big, at least 200 pounds, maybe bigger. The dog it was eating was already quite large. I'm a skeptic. To this day, this is the only unexplainable creepy thing I've ever seen with my two eyes. That truly shook me to my core. For months I couldn't stop thinking about it, and it still scares me and disturbs me to think about the story.